Well, you ain't seen nothing yet, because our next speaker is going to talk about all the wonders that lie ahead. He's going to tell us about Humans 3.0. Peter Nowak. Hey, Peter.
Hi, Metis.
Good to meet you.
Thank you. All right, hi everybody. Are we ready to take a trip to Utopia? Okay, good. We have to take a quick pit stop first, though. Last month, the FBI accused a man of hacking into a plane's control systems via its entertainment system. And this man, a security researcher, he wasn't malicious about it, but he apparently did this about 20 times over the course of 3 years. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but that scares the crap out of me. You know, the thought that somebody could take control of an airplane, it conjures up all kinds of terrifying possibilities. And it's also, I think, the idea also strikes at the core of this ill ease that we have with technology today. Whether it's planes or cars or our homes or phones, it seems like we're just a hair's breadth away from utter disaster. But here's the thing. Last year in 2014, there were 111 plane crashes in the world. Now, that sounds like a lot, but it's actually the fewest ever in the jet age in the last 80 years. And in fact, there are about 2 crashes for every million flights. Now, 2 for every million is not a lot at all. Obviously, 2 is too many, but that's, you know, the grand ratio, that's not a lot at all. And 2014 was not an aberration. The number of plane crashes has been declining steadily for decades. And the main reason for that is because of all that technology in the planes. Here's a fun fact. Most airlines don't actually own the jets that are connected to their planes. They actually rent them on an hourly basis from the manufacturers. And the manufacturers are in constant communication with those jets, and they're monitoring their performance and matching that up against incoming weather data to basically they're able to spot problems before they happen. So this is why planes are flying longer, further, and ultimately safer. So that catastrophic hack, it hasn't happened yet, and whether you believe it will or not depends largely on whether you are a pessimist or an optimist. And this is what I want to talk about today, is I think we are actually being conditioned to be pessimists. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory. I think it's just a byproduct of how technology is developing, and specifically how technology is causing the media to develop. And I think this is a very dangerous issue, because pessimism can lead to us becoming more cynical and more distrustful, not just of technology, but also of each other. So let's talk about the human nervous system for a second. It's a bit of a funny thing. You can wake up in the morning and your knee hurts, and this is your body telling you, hey, there's something wrong here, this needs attention. But what your body doesn't tell you on a daily basis is all the good stuff that's going on, that your neck doesn't hurt, that your liver is fine, that your circulation is working, no problems there. And it's funny because the media is plays very much the same role. The media is very much like the nervous system. Its main purpose is to tell us about what's going wrong. So the news media is there to tell us about the facts, hopefully, about what's going wrong. Social media is there to tell us how people are feeling about what's going wrong. And popular entertainment is there to suggest things that could go wrong in the future. So I think when you put all these things together, it's like we're drinking from a fire hose daily of what's going wrong with the world, and you get bonus points if you get this reference. Now, conversely, we don't have a lot of people or a lot of sources telling us about what's going right, just as the nervous system doesn't tell us what's going right. And that's a problem because that actually affects our brain. It affects the way we think, and it affects the way we view the world. So we'll take you back to the 1970s, when a communications professor named George Gerbner, he came up with a theory called the mean world syndrome. And basically what that was is he believed that exposure to too much violent imagery or commentary was enough to cause negative cognitive bias. In other words, it was enough to make people think, as we just heard, that they live in a world that is worse off than it is. And this is a problem because it leads to things like depression, fear, anxiety, even substance abuse. In a technological context, what it means is that we tend to focus more on the side effects of technology as opposed to the effects. We pay more attention to the potential hacking of the plane, the side effect, than we do to the declining number of crashes, which is the effect. A great example of this, and this is where if we pay attention or if we give too much weight to those side effects, the problem that can occur there is that we become oblivious to the side effects. It's kind of, you can call it the Chicken Little effect. And there's a great example of this is climate change, as a matter of fact. Climate change is the biggest side effect of technological advance that there is, and it's a potentially catastrophic side effect. Yet, fewer and fewer people every year, fewer and fewer people every year care about it. And there's an element of fatigue at play here. People are just tired of hearing the horror stories about the polar ice caps melting. But there's more to it as well. Psychologists and economists agree that if you really want people to care about something, you have to give them positive incentives to do so, as opposed to trying to scare them into it with horror stories. So what we don't see enough of when it comes to climate change are the stories of people who are perhaps saving money by converting their cars and their homes to green alternatives, or who are losing weight and feeling better about themselves by switching to plant-based diets. So when you give people the positive outcomes, that's a great way to get people to, more people will actually recognize that positive outcome, and they're more likely to internalize it as their own goal. A good example of this comes from Norway, actually, where some psychologists did an experiment at a restaurant in Oslo, and they took the vegetarian option and labeled it as the chef's special. And what they found was that just that subtle poking of people led to more and more people ordering this dish, and it actually led to a significant decrease in meat consumption at this restaurant. So that's a very small example, but you can imagine what the effects of that might be on a larger scale. On the flip side, one of the big negative stories that we hear a lot about today are robots taking our jobs. And not a day goes by when we don't hear about some new profession being performed by robots, whether it's robot doctors or lawyers or bartenders or firefighters or writers or speech givers and so on and so on. And the reason we see so many of these stories is because they're very easy to tell. They're very easy to relate to because they're in front of us and they're concrete. You can look at a robot that's mixing drinks and say, hey, bartenders, you guys have some problems here. The inverse of that, or the reverse of that, we don't see a lot of because it's harder to tell. Those stories require imagination. The stories about what are these robots going to enable us to do in the future. I'll give you two interesting stories I found in the last year in just doing my work. I spoke to an artist last year in Los Angeles. His name is Matthias Dorfelt. And what he does is he's creating human robot art. He has these robots, they look a little bit like Roomba vacuum cleaners, and he programs them with his own drawing style, and then he unleashes them to create what they will. And what they come up with, he calls meta-creations. And this is what he said. So he said, I think more about the idea of the composition than an explicit composition that is static or fixed. I'm still very actively involved in that process, and that's true for all artists. And then the key point, it changes the level at which creativity is applied. So further to that, last year at the South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas, a group of chefs teamed up with IBM's Watson. This is the supercomputer that beat humans at Jeopardy a few years ago. And they teamed up to create new food concoctions. And so what Watson was doing was analyzing and calculating new pairings of ingredients based on what we humans find to be pleasant taste combinations. And so what the chefs were telling me was great about this interaction was that Watson was able to suggest to them new ideas that they hadn't thought of because they have their own biases. Every chef has their preferred ingredients or their preferred techniques. And so what Watson was able to do was provide suggestions that they hadn't considered, and they springboarded from those suggestions to create crazy new foods like Cuban lobster bouillabaisse and Azerbaijani saffron cake. So these are two examples of the potential that robots and the internet and all kinds of various technological automation are going to enable. And I think that people who are worried that robots are going to take all of our jobs, or that the internet's going to take all of our jobs, or even that the internet is going to cause us to think at a more shallow level, I think it's actually the opposite of that. As our friend Dorfelt, the artist, said, technology changes the level at which creativity is applied. It raises the level at which creativity is applied. I have to admit to robots sparking my own imagination. My wife likes to tell me that I make the world's best pierogies. And at the risk of sounding immodest, I'm not going to disagree. My pierogies really are amazing. I've actually fantasized numerous times about opening my own restaurant. But the problem is, I don't know if anybody's ever tried to make pierogies from scratch, but they're extremely labor-intensive. And so I've often thought, if only I could create a robot that would do the filling and the folding for me, only then would I actually think about doing a restaurant. In recent times, though, I've actually been thinking bigger, because I've started to look at the technologies like robot cars and drones. And what I think those technologies, as they're advancing quickly and they're becoming cheaper, and eventually the laws governing them are going to fall into place. But I think those two particular technologies are going to spark a very big change or a disruption in distribution systems. Right now, if you make a product and you want to get it out there, you have to deal with fleets of trucks, or you have to deal with the postal service and so on. I think what we're going to see with robot cars and drones is almost like an Uberization of distribution, where individuals are going to be able to distribute their own products. So in my own context, I'm not just thinking about a pierogi restaurant, I'm thinking about a pierogi empire. And if there are any venture capitalists here, I'll be happy to talk to you later. So these are all examples, I think, of the stories, more of the stories that we need to tell in order to focus on what our goals are going to be in the future. We can sit back and let technology happen to us and let those side effects happen to us. But I think if we think a little bit more about the possibilities, then we can create more goals for ourselves that are more positive facing. Now, this is all not to say that we don't need that fire hose of what's going wrong with the world. I think that's still very important. It's absolutely important, because we still do need to identify the problems in the world so that we can talk about them and resolve them. But at the same time, I think we do need to be cognizant of mean world syndrome, and that it is real, and I think we need to consciously work to counter it. And the best way to do this is by consciously seeking out positive news, and more importantly, sharing it. And if you're the type of person that gets affirmation from Facebook likes or retweets on Twitter, the good news is that many studies have shown that if you share something positive, that's more likely to get passed around than something that is negative. And if you don't believe me on that, I challenge you to go home and put up a cute cat video on Facebook and see how many likes you get. The other part of this, too, is the good news is there is good news. You just have to look for it. Here's just a smattering of some of the positive developments that are going on in the world. Now, technology isn't directly responsible for all of these, but it's definitely contributing to many of them, whether it's increasing life expectancy or declining hunger, or, as we heard in the previous presentation, declining war and murder, and so on and so on. I cover a lot of these topics in my book, Humans 3.0, Cheap Plug Time. And in this book, I look at how technology has affected many of these different aspects of society and what it means to be human. And I try not to gloss over the problems or the side effects, but my general conclusion is, as we heard in the previous conversation, that we are actually living at the best of times. This is the best the world has ever been in by many measures. And that's not to short shrift some of the problems that we have. But one of the best developments that I think we've seen over the last, particularly the last century, is this improvement through communications technology in the relationships that we have with one another. And whether that's on an individual basis between friends, or on a macro basis between nations, our relationships are becoming more complex. And that's great, because more complexity means the partners in the relationship need each other more. And when you need each other more, you are more likely to help each other as opposed to fight and steal from each other. And that's good. There are many examples to the contrary, obviously, but I think on a fundamental level, more and more of us are realizing this. And I think what we're realizing is that for there to be winners, there don't necessarily have to be losers. So I guess that's the effect. That's the effect of all of this dramatic change in technology, mean world syndrome, and that fire hose is the side effect. And I do realize that it's ironic that I just spent the whole time telling you about the side effect when I said that we need to pay less attention to the side effect. But I'm just doing my job as somebody in the media. So I guess the last thing I'll say is one of the other big counters to mean world syndrome, I think that's very important, is for us to disconnect, to get off the internet, to get off our TV screens, to get off our phones as much as possible, because it is a great world out there, and it's getting better all the time, but how mean it is depends entirely on our perspective, and we're more likely to see it as mean if we're only looking at it through screens rather than with our own eyes. Thanks, everybody. That's everything I got.